Laramie, Wyoming, October, 1888. The wind already had the bite of a predator, a dry, high plains cold that promised a winter of malice. It scoured the dust from the railroad yard, rattling the windows of the foreman's office, and whipping away the smoke from the newly built cabins on the edge of town. Out on a barren plot leased from the Union Pacific for pennies, a man was building a home. Or, to the men who watched him during their breaks, he was building a joke. The man was Stefan Kovac, a Polish immigrant with shoulders thickened by labor, and a quiet that the locals mistook for simplicity. His home was a derelict railroad boxcar, its paint peeling, its wood scarred by years of hauling freight across the continent. He'd bought it for $15, the price of a decent coat. Now he was turning it into a home for his wife and two small children. Silas Croft, the town's lumber mill foreman and its most respected carpenter, watched from a distance, shaking his head. Croft was a man who believed in the visible evidence of strength: thick, hand-hewn logs, dovetailed corners, a roof pitched to shed a mountain of snow. He saw none of that here. He saw a thin-walled crate of wood and steel, a conductor of cold, a box-shaped coffin waiting for the first blizzard. He's lining it with tar paper, one of the rail workers, a man named Henderson, noted with a chuckle, as if that'll stop a Wyoming winter. Croft grunted, his gaze fixed on Kovac's methodical movements. The pole wasn't just tacking up paper. He was building a second, smaller box inside the first, a delicate frame of 2x4s that stood entirely separate from the outer walls of the boxcar. It looked flimsy, a doll's house inside a shipping crate. "It's foolishness," Croft declared, his voice carrying the weight of authority. He'd built half the homes in Laramie. He knew the physics of survival at 7,000 feet. That steel box will be an icebox by November. The frost will grow an inch thick on the inside of those walls. He's putting his family in a death trap. The other men murmured in agreement. They saw a man spending his last dollars on a project doomed to fail. They saw a crazy foreigner who didn't understand the brutal arithmetic of this place. They saw a man sealing his family into a tomb. The mockery was not loud or cruel, not yet. It was the confident pity of experienced men watching a novice make a fatal error. What did this Polish boilermaker, a man who had spent his life working with steam and steel, understand about the invisible currents of heat and cold that the most experienced frontier carpenters had missed? This story is about more than just a strange house. It's about a hidden principle of physics that can mean the difference between life and death. I promise you, by the end of this, you will understand why a pocket of empty air can be a more powerful shield against the cold than a foot of solid oak. If you find value in uncovering forgotten wisdom, consider subscribing to this channel and liking this video. And let me know in the comments, what's the most unconventional solution to a problem you've ever seen work? Stefan Kovac was not a carpenter. He had never felled a tree, hewn a log, or cut a dovetail joint in his life. In the bustling, soot-stained workshops of Warsaw, he had been a coppersmith and a boilermaker. His hands were not accustomed to the grain of wood, but to the cold sheet of metal. He understood rivets, solder, and the immense, invisible power of steam. His work was the containment of pressure, the management of extreme heat, the absolute necessity of a perfect seal. A boiler that leaked wasn't inefficient. It was a bomb. This education in the unforgiving laws of thermodynamics had been written onto his hands in scars and calluses. He, his wife Aniela, and their children, Jan and Zofia, had arrived in Laramie the previous autumn, drawn by the promise of work on the ever-expanding railroad. They spent their first winter in a rented shack on the edge of town, a structure built with the haste and carelessness of a landlord who would never have to live in it. It was a textbook example of conventional frontier building and a thermal catastrophe. Gaps in the chinking invited the wind inside as a constant malevolent guest. The single-plank walls offered as much insulation as a wool blanket might offer a swimmer in a frozen lake. That first winter had nearly broken them. Aniela had developed a pneumonia that left her breathing in shallow, rattling gasps for weeks. The children, Jan and Zofia, slept in their coats and hats, their faces pale, their small bodies perpetually shivering. Stefan remembered the endless, exhausting work of feeding the stove. He burned through their savings, buying cord after cord of wood, only to watch the heat rush up the chimney or bleed directly through the walls. He could hold his hand 6 inches from the stove and feel warmth, a foot away, and the brutal cold of the room took over. It was like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in the bottom. That winter, he didn't just feel the cold, he studied it. He watched the way frost formed near the floor. He saw how a candle flame would flicker and bend in the direction of the coldest wall, pulled by an invisible river of air. He, a man who understood sealed systems, was living in a sieve. He swore he would never let his family suffer like that again. The problem wasn't the cold outside. The problem was the house itself. In Laramie, the standard of excellence was the log cabin, the kind Silas Croft built. These structures were monuments to material strength. Their thick walls, some over 1.5 feet wide, seemed to promise a fortress-like defense against the winter. But it was a promise they couldn't keep. The failure was rooted in a fundamental misunderstanding of heat transfer. The primary enemy in a Wyoming winter wasn't just conduction, heat leaking directly through the logs. The greater, more insidious thief was convection. On a day when the outside temperature was 10 degrees below zero, the outer surface of a log wall would be, for all intents and purposes, 10 below. Through conduction, that cold would slowly creep through the wood, so the inside surface of that same log might be only 20 or 30 degrees Fahrenheit, even with a fire blazing inside. This cold interior wall acted as a catalyst. The air molecules next to it would rapidly cool, becoming denser and heavier. This heavy, cold air would then sink, sliding down the wall and spilling across the floor like an invisible tide. This created a vacuum that pulled the warmer, lighter air from near the ceiling and the stove towards the wall, where it too would be chilled and sink. The result was a constant, imperceptible, and relentless circulation, a convective loop. It was a perpetual motion machine designed to suck the warmth out of everything and everyone in the room. Families like the Jacksons and the Millers, neighbors in their own sturdy, Croft-approved cabins, were living proof of this principle. They stuffed every crack with rags and mud, they burned wood at an astonishing rate, yet their floors were always icy. Their children were forbidden from playing on the floor. They lived in a stratified world. Their heads might be warm, but their feet were always freezing. They were fighting a battle against an enemy they couldn't see, an enemy their own homes were designed to create. The very substance of their walls, the vaunted thermal mass of the logs, became a heat sink, an engine for the cold. Silas Croft saw mass and thought strength. Stefan Kovacs saw it and recognized a thermal liability. Stefan's work on the Boxcar was a study in precision and thrift. The derelict car, a standard 40-foot model, cost him $15. The railroad foreman, amused by the Pole's ambition, let him have it for a song. Stefan spent another $10 on salvaged 2x4s and thin tongue-and-groove planks from Croft's lumber mill, the cheap stuff, warped and knotted, that no respectable builder would use for a proper home. His largest expense was $25 for a small, efficient cast-iron stove and several rolls of thick black tar paper. His total investment was less than $60. A proper log cabin, even a small one, cost 3 to 4 times that amount. His process baffled the onlookers. First, he did not modify the boxcar's exterior. He left the sliding door on one side and the smaller man door on the other. He plugged the obvious holes with wood scraps and tar, but his focus was entirely on the interior. Inside, he laid down a floor frame of 2x4s, raising it up on small wooden blocks. This new floor was 8 inches inside the boxcar's main floor. Then he erected the walls, a simple frame of studs, also set in 8 inches from the boxcar's own planked walls. He built a ceiling frame, again, leaving an 8-inch gap below the boxcar's curved roof. He had constructed a complete freestanding room floating in the center of the boxcar. Next came the ceiling. This is where his Boilermaker's training became evident. He didn't just tack up the tar paper, he overlapped each seam by 6 inches, sealing it with hot tar he melted over a small fire. He worked with a focused intensity that silenced some of the snickering. He was creating a membrane, an unbroken, airtight envelope. He wrapped the entire interior frame, floor, walls, and ceiling in this black skin. Finally, he painstakingly nailed up the thin, cheap tongue-and-groove planks over the tar paper, creating a clean, simple wooden room. He built a small, heavily insulated inner door that fit snugly into its frame. The original boxcar door now opened into a small, unheated transitional space, a primitive mudroom. The inner door opened into his family's living space. Silas Croft came by one afternoon as Stefan was finishing the interior. He ran his hand over the thin plank wall. It felt flimsy, unsubstantial. He knocked on it. The sound was hollow. "That air gap is useless, Kovac," Silas said, his tone a mixture of professional diagnosis and genuine concern. "It's just more space to heat. And that thin inner wall has no thermal mass. A good log wall, 2 feet thick, that's what holds the heat. The fire heats the log, and the log radiates it back all night. You've built a coffin, not a home." Stefan paused his work, wiping sweat from his brow despite the autumn chill. He looked at the respected carpenter, a man whose certainty was as solid as the foundations he laid. He didn't argue. He didn't defend his design with complex theories. He offered only a simple statement of principle, the core of his entire creation. "The air must be still," he said, and then he returned to his work, fitting a small pane of glass into a perfectly sealed frame. The physics behind Stefan's strange construction were both simple and profound. Silas Croft was not wrong about thermal mass. A thick, heavy log wall can indeed absorb and radiate a great deal of heat, but he was operating in a system where that stored heat was being constantly stolen by convection. Stefan had chosen to fight a different battle. He ignored the idea of thermal mass and focused entirely on defeating the convective loop. He had weaponized air itself. Heat moves in 3 ways: conduction, direct transfer, radiation, infrared waves, and convection, movement of a fluid like air or water. In a frontier cabin, convection was the dominant form of heat loss, accounting for perhaps 70% of the wasted energy. Imagine the air inside a standard cabin as a billion tiny ball bearings. The fire in the stove energizes these ball bearings, making them bounce around faster and spread out, becoming less dense. This is warm air. But against the cold interior wall, the ball bearings slow down dramatically, huddling together, becoming denser. This dense, heavy air sinks. This simple act of sinking is the engine of the entire system. It is the beginning of the draft that chills the ankles and steals the heat. Stefan's design, the room within a room, created what building scientists today would call a dead air space. By trapping a thick 8-inch layer of air and, crucially, by making the interior shell airtight, he prevented that air from moving. It could not circulate. It could not form a convective loop. This trapped, still air became the primary insulation. Air is a surprisingly poor conductor of heat. Its insulating value, or R value, is quite high, provided it is still. The problem is that it rarely stays still. Stefan's design forced it to. The heat from his small stove warmed the air inside his small sealed living space. This warm air heated the thin inner wall. Because the air in the 8-inch gap was still, it transferred that heat to the cold outer wall of the boxcar very, very slowly. The inner wall therefore never became cold enough to start the convective cycle inside the living space. Its surface temperature remained close to the ambient temperature of the room. The result was a home that required shockingly little energy to heat. He wasn't trying to heat a large, drafty boxcar. He was only heating the small, sealed, wooden room inside it. The BTUs, the actual units of heat energy produced by his stove, stayed where they were needed. They weren't being actively pumped outside by a relentless convective engine. The mockery from the townsfolk came from a failure of imagination. They looked at the boxcar and saw a flimsy, uninsulated shed. They could not see the invisible shield, the thick blanket of perfectly still air that Stefan had wrapped his family in. He hadn't built a house. He had built a thermos. The first snows came in November, dusting the high plains in white. By early December, the cold was entrenched. Then, on the winter solstice, the sky to the north turned a strange, bruised purple-gray. The wind died, an eerie silence falling over Laramie. The old-timers knew the signs. A blue norther was coming. Within an hour, the world disappeared. The wind arrived not as a gust, but as a solid wall of force, carrying with it a blinding curtain of fine, sharp snow. The temperature, which had been a tolerable 15 degrees, plummeted. Within 3 hours, it was 10 below zero. By midnight, it was 30 below. The wind howled at a steady 50 miles per hour, a sound like a freight train that never passed. In Silas Croft's sturdy, well-built log home, the battle for warmth was a losing one. Despite having one of the tightest-built houses in town, the sheer force of the wind drove the cold deep into the logs. Ice crystals bloomed on the heads of the nails inside the walls. A thick layer of frost grew in the corners of the rooms. His wife, Mary, had hung heavy blankets over the doors and windows, but still the drafts snaked across the floor. They had a large fireplace and a new iron stove, both burning furiously, the stovepipe glowing a dull red. Yet the heat seemed to vanish as soon as it left the metal. The family was huddled together on the hearth, wrapped in every blanket they owned. Silas felt a deep, gnawing anxiety. His house, his masterpiece of frontier craftsmanship, was failing. And as he sat there, shivering in his own home, his thoughts turned to the Polish fool in the boxcar. He felt a pang of guilt sharp as an icicle. He pictured the thin walls, the metal roof. By now it must be colder inside that box than it was outside. The wind would be screaming through it. He imagined the family, frozen, huddled around a dead stove. The image was unbearable. It was one thing to mock a man's foolishness in the clear light of autumn. It was another to let his family die for it in the dark of a blizzard. Driven by a sense of duty that overrode all reason, Silas pulled on his heaviest coat, wrapped his face in wool, and lit a lantern. He went to his woodshed and loaded a heavy canvas sling with his best, driest logs. Wood he knew his own family would need. He would not have it on his conscience that he sat warm while they froze. He opened his door and plunged into the maelstrom. The walk to the edge of town was a fight for every step. The wind tore the breath from his lungs, and the visibility was less than 10 feet. He navigated by memory, his beard freezing solid. Finally, he stumbled up to the dark, hulking shape of the boxcar. It was silent, save for the shriek of the wind off its steel roof. There was no smoke from the stovepipe. His heart sank. He was too late. He hammered on the large sliding door with his gloved fist, shouting Kovach's name. The sound was swallowed by the storm. He moved to the smaller door and hammered again, harder, his panic rising. After a long moment, the door scraped open a few inches. Stefan Kovac stood there, holding a small lamp. A swirl of snow and wind blasted into the small, dark space between the doors. "Kovac, my God, man, are you all right?" Silas yelled over the wind. "I've brought wood. Your fire must be out." Stefan simply nodded and stepped back, opening the door wider. Silas pushed his way in, dragging the sling of wood behind him. The outer door slammed shut, plunging them into a sudden, shocking quiet. The roar of the blizzard was instantly muffled, as if coming from a great distance. They stood in the small, unheated space, the air frigid. Before them was the second inner door. "You must be freezing," Silas said, his voice trembling from cold and exertion. "Let's get this fire going." Stefan looked at him, his expression calm. He said nothing. He simply reached out, lifted the latch on the inner door, and pulled it open. Silas Croft braced himself for a wave of deeper cold, for the smell of a dead fire and icy air. What he got was something else entirely. It was not a blast of heat, like one would get from opening an oven. It was a profound, enveloping stillness. The air that touched his face was warm, yes, but what struck him, what stopped his heart for a second, was its absolute lack of movement. In his own home, a few hundred yards away, the air was a turbulent, swirling mass of drafts and currents. Here it was as calm and motionless as the air on a perfect summer evening. He stepped across the threshold into the family's living space. The room was small, simple, and bathed in the soft glow of an oil lamp. The little stove in the corner was burning with a low, gentle fire, its metal a soft, dark gray, not the glowing red of his own overworked stove. Aniela Kovac looked up from her sewing and smiled a welcome. On the floor, on a small rag rug, the two children, Jan and Zofia, were asleep under a single wool blanket. They were wearing simple nightshirts. Their faces were flush with warmth, their breathing deep and even. Silas stood in the middle of the room, stunned into silence. He slowly pulled off a glove. He held his bare hand up in the middle of the room. He felt nothing. No draft, no current, no whisper of moving air. The blizzard could have been 1,000 miles away. He walked to the inner wall and placed his palm against the thin planks. It was cool to the touch, but it wasn't the life-sucking cold of his own log walls. It felt neutral, inert. He looked at the small, placid stove, then at the sleeping children, then at the pile of wood he had dragged through a blizzard. He saw the truth in a single, crushing, clarifying moment. All his experience, all his beliefs about mass and strength and the nature of cold were wrong. He had been fighting the enemy with the wrong weapons. His face, which had been numb with cold, drained of all color. He looked at Stefan Kovac, this quiet man he had dismissed as a fool. His voice, when it came, was a choked whisper. "My God, Kovac," he said, his eyes scanning the impossible peace of the room. "You didn't build a wall. You built a calm." The story of that night and of Silas Croft's delivery of unneeded firewood became a Laramie legend. Croft, humbled and intellectually electrified, became Stefan Kovac's greatest advocate. He didn't just admit he was wrong, he sought to understand why. He spent hours in the boxcar, his carpenter's mind dissecting the principles of the still air gap. He who had always prized the visible learned to respect the invisible. That spring, when the building season began, Silas Croft started offering a new option to his clients. He called it the Kovac Wall. It was a double-stud wall with a wide sealed air cavity, a direct application of the boxcar's design to traditional frame construction. It was more expensive in labor but saved a fortune in firewood. The first few clients were skeptical, but Croft's reputation was unassailable. When he vouched for it, people listened. The idea spread most quickly among the railroad workers. They were practical men who understood the brutal realities of the high plains. Several of them acquired their own decommissioned boxcars and, under Stefan's quiet guidance, replicated his design. By the winter of 1890, a small community of these strange, hyper-efficient homes had sprung up. The fuel savings were dramatic. Families reported burning half, sometimes only a third, of the wood they had used in conventional cabins. The most significant adoption came from the Union Pacific Railroad itself. An engineering supervisor tasked with reducing the massive cost of shipping coal to heat the remote section houses along the high-altitude lines heard the stories from Laramie. After a single visit to the Kovac boxcar, he ordered all new section houses between Cheyenne and Ogden to be built, using a double-wall design based on Stefan's principles. The Kovac wall saved the railroad thousands of dollars and immeasurably improved the lives of the lonely crews who kept the tracks clear through the winter. Stefan Kovac never patented his idea or sought any payment. When asked, he simply shared what he knew. That, he felt, was enough. What Stefan Kovac had created out of desperation and his unique background was a precursor to a core tenet of modern building science. His dead air space is the direct ancestor of the insulated cavities in every modern wall. His perfectly sealed inner envelope anticipated the principles of airtightness that are now essential to high-efficiency construction and the passive house movement. Double and triple pane windows, which are standard today, operate on the exact same principle, trapping a layer of still air or gas between panes of glass to stop heat transfer. A Polish boiler maker in a Wyoming railroad town, using scrap lumber and tar paper, had stumbled upon a fundamental truth of thermodynamics a century before it would become mainstream. The frontier was a place that tested ideas against the unforgiving reality of nature. It did not care about tradition, reputation, or conventional wisdom. It rewarded what worked. The men of Laramie respected the tangible strength of a thick log wall because they could see it, touch it, measure its heft. But the greatest strength in Stefan Kovac's design was invisible. It was the nothingness between the walls. It was the carefully managed void. His genius was not in what he added, but in what he understood about the empty space. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the most effective solutions lie not in more material, but in the intelligent control of the principles you cannot see, the calm at the center of the storm. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the past. If this story of hidden ingenuity resonated with you, please consider liking this video and subscribing for more tales of forgotten history. And let us know in the comments, what other invisible forces, like convection, have a huge impact on our daily lives? This video presents a historically inspired reconstruction for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictional, but the building techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. Anyone attempting to apply these or other historical building methods today should consult with qualified professionals and adhere to all modern building codes, safety guidelines, and local regulations. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.